Welcome to Wind Down Wednesday. Here are your hosts, Jeffrey Tobias Halter and Amanda Hammett.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. This is Women's History Month, and we again are focusing on women in the workplace. My name is Amanda Hammett, and today for Wind Down Wednesday, I'm actually drinking an oat milk latte that we're going to be enjoying throughout today's episode. Jeffrey, what are you drinking today?
Yeah, I think it's a similar theme. I have a decaf with just a little touch of Bailey's Irish cream because, sometimes you just need to wind down a little. So it's my honor today to introduce today's guest, my friend and colleague, W. Brad Johnson. Brad's the professor of psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the United States Naval Academy, and a faculty member in the Graduate School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. He has written multiple books. His most recent work is right here. Brad, it is dog-eared. I use this all the time in my research. It is amazing. And I'm asking all our readers to go out and pick up a copy. Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And then his book just prior to that with his co-author David Smith was Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women. So we're happy to have you on the show.
Great to be with you, Jeffrey and Amanda.
Well, great. So Brad, before we dive into Wind Down Wednesday topics, what's your beverage of choice today?
Kind of like you and Jeffrey, this afternoon, I'm still winding down with my French roast. But I'm really close to saying coffee, you're on the bench, alcohol, suit up. And when that happens, I go for a hazy IPA always. And nice. So that's coming up for me. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Brad, I want to welcome you, a kindred spirit and colleague. We just don't get to work together enough. And I'm so happy to have you on the show. Typically we talk by phone and your co-author, David Smith, joins us. We compare notes on gender in the workplace and specifically male allyship. And what a hot topic right now. McKinsey came out last year and said only 14% of companies are doing allyship training. And there's such a critical need for this work. So to set context for our discussion today, can you talk about your research for the book and also outline why men need to be included in organizational gender equality efforts?
Yeah. Happy to start there, Jeffrey. And it's such an important question. I think that my starting comment there is this is Women's History Month. We need to acknowledge that women have been carrying all the water on gender equity for millennia. And, when we look at anything like voting rights or pay equity, any progress that we see there has been because women have been doing this work. And we've made some progress. The problem is, if you look at the World Bank estimate a couple of years ago about when we'll actually get to pay equity, it's something like 200 years, right? And during the pandemic, we took a big step back. So it's something like 230 years now till we just closed the pay equity gap. Why is that? Well, it's not because women are not working at this. It's because men have traditionally not engaged, right? They hear words like gender, equity, inclusion, and they immediately assume that's a women's thing, and I don't have a role to play there. And I think a big piece of our messaging has been, no, gentlemen, we're getting this wrong. This is a leadership issue. It's not a women's issue. And men have a crucial role to play. If you want to just look at the evidence about how male engagement changes the way women see the workplace, our favorite study is from Boston Consulting Group. This was a huge study across lots of companies going out and asking women specifically, is your company making real progress on the inclusion of women in your workplace? The number one predictor of whether women across organizations said yes or no to that question was whether or not they saw men in their own organizations championing gender diversity and inclusion. When that was the case, 96% of women in this huge study said, yep, we're getting it. I see the progress versus only 30% of women when they didn't see their male colleagues engaging. So it should be real clear to us whether we're looking at tech or finance or law or medicine. Yes, more women are coming in the door, but when you look at the senior leadership positions, who holds the power, who's got the social capital and the privilege to actually make change, typically that remains men. So men have got to come to the table. And, just one caveat here, and I think this really applies to men who think, oh, yeah, we're doing this. We're doing equity. I'm an ally. Another great study by Promundo went out and asked both men and women, are men really showing up? Are they doing this work in the workplace? And men, I think the number was something like 77% of men said, oh, yeah, we're doing this. I'm doing it. Then they asked, their female colleagues, and it was something like 30%. So we have a disconnect. We've got a gap in the way we assume we're doing the work. And in fact, women, our colleagues, have a very different perspective on this.
That's really fascinating. I thank you for bringing that particular statistic to light. So I'd like to keep on this allyship track, if you don't mind. Your book, Good Guys, you outline several different types of allyship. Would you share an overview with the audience about interpersonal allyship and public allyship?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, Amanda. In all of the Jeffrey held up our book, Good Guys, at the beginning of this. And we spent a considerable amount of time, I think it was about 2 years, doing the research for that book. Lots and lots of interviews with women and then men that they nominated, that they really thought demonstrated allyship. And across all of that data gathering, one thing became very clear. There were sort of two big buckets of things that male allies did behaviorally that women really appreciated. And as you said, the first category was interpersonal. And the message to men that I want to give you right off the bat is this is the easy part. We're going to get to the hard part here in a minute. The easy part, the interpersonal piece, this is about how I hold myself accountable in relationships with my female colleagues. This is really about how I show up in my everyday behavior with women. And there are some key things that were kind of at the top of the list across the women that we interviewed. Number one, this one may sound so basic, but it's one that a lot of men miss. It's could you listen? Apparently men are not very good at this across, don't want to stereotype guys, but we are not by and large generous listeners. That is something that doesn't come easily to a lot of men. And we have to work on this. So Dave and I would just shake our heads after some of these interviews, and we really got the message that the number one thing a lot of women were asking for was, dude, could you just listen? And so let's start there. Could I listen generously with an intent to understand, not to fix her problems? Number two, could you avoid assumptions about her, right? Because she's a woman, she must want this, or she'd never be interested in doing this in her career. No, I really got to check myself. It's a very easy thing for men to do, to make assumptions. And I really have to rein that in and check in with her and ask those discerning questions. In a perfect world, where would you go in your career? What would that look like for you? What would your balance in terms of work life look like? It might be very different than mine, but I really want to devote the time to understand that. How about building your gender intelligence, right? Your GQ. Are you watching or listening to Wind Down Wednesday and reading books about gender equity? Are you doing the work as a male to better understand the women around you? And this includes the intersections, right? Women of color, Black women, LGBTQ women, recognizing that all women don't have the same experiences. Are you pursuing friendships with women? Are you earning trust with some women around you so that you have a cadre of women who are willing to give you the hard feedback when you get things wrong and also are in your corner when you're getting it right, and let you know that. Men don't realize, I think, often that they need that kind of support, that they need that transparent feedback from women.
Mhm.
And it can be golden when they get that, but I think they've got to do the work to build trust with some women if that's going to happen. And then let's get to, those are just a few, and I can elaborate if you want to hear more interpersonal. But let's get to the hard part, the public part of allyship. This was, that piece where I have to actually hold other men accountable, and I have to hold my organization accountable. This is where I really put some more skin in the game as a male. This is where I can begin to feel real anxiety. I'm worried about getting called out by other men. I'm worried about the wimp penalty, as it were, or losing my man card. But here are some of the things I've got to do. I have to have some situational awareness. I got to show up, for example, in a meeting and recognize who's there, who's not, who didn't get invited, who's getting interrupted 3 times as much as men in the room. That's typically a woman. Who's having her ideas stolen? Who's being ignored in the context of the meeting? I got to sift the ambient, verbal environment for sexist, biased language. Am I really paying attention to that?
Yeah.
When that guy walks in the meeting and says, "Hey, what are you girls gossiping about?" Do I notice that?
Mm-hmm.
Can I hear the microaggression? Certainly, I hope I can hear the more egregious sexist language. But am I really devoting time to situational awareness? Then, how about the disruption piece? So, let me just give you an example. There you are, and you're discussing the lack of women in leadership in your company, and some guy says, "You know why that is? Women just don't want to work as hard." Okay, so there it is. Boom, that sexist comment just dropped on the table. The question is, what do you do? And too often the answer is bystander paralysis creeps in and nobody says anything. This especially applies to men. And so I got to say something. And if I'm not sure what to say, how about just a simple disruption within 2 seconds, like, ouch, or just a Socratic question like, dude, what did you mean by that? Could you explain that? I'm confused because I know a lot of women who work very hard. So could you, often just asking a question or saying ouch is a perfect way to disrupt that. But I don't have the choice, if I really want to show up as an ally, to just sit silently in that moment. Now, Dave and I talk a lot about the fact that I've got a calculus to go through. Maybe that guy was my boss. Maybe that guy is just a clueless, bumbling dude who normally doesn't say that kind of thing. Maybe I'm going to go to him after the meeting, close the door, and in a spirit of confrontation say, "Hey, buddy, when you said that today, no. Everybody cringed. Let me tell you why. You need to get better. I'm sharing this because I care about you." So holding other men accountable, however that's going to look, that's simply not an option. How about transparency as another public act, right? Pay equity. We're not getting to pay equity. Part of the reason is that there's so much secrecy around who makes how much money. And often this gets perpetuated because we men share our salaries with each other in the men's room or at golf or beers after work, but we don't pull our female colleagues into the conversation. So she has no idea what she should be negotiating for and what men at her level are making. I got to fight back on that and not tolerate secrecy. And maybe, just one other kind of public piece here, and I'm going to tie this to the pandemic. Am I advocating for policies that work for everybody? We're coming out of a pandemic where we learned that hybrid remote work can work very well and that women take advantage of that more often than men do. I wish more men would, but currently that's something that more women lean into. Recognizing that a lot of talented women are going to get lost in the shuffle if we don't have programs that allow flexibility. Am I, as a senior male or a male with some power, advocating for that and saying, hey, we need to upscale opportunity for flex work. We need to lean into this or we're not going to be competitive in hiring and promoting and advancing women.
Brett, I'd love to build on that because you just talked about senior leaders and you have a whole chapter on sponsoring women loudly. Two things, how can that work effectively without looking self-serving? Because your book also talks about how quickly it is that men get caught up in doing this for the wrong reason. And so, number one, how do they do it in an honest manner? But then briefly, for our women listening, how can they encourage or get a sponsor?
Yeah, great questions. And first of all, let me just kind of note that I think very often there's a tendency recently, I notice, for people to want to really draw a firm divide between mentoring and sponsoring. I tend not to do that. I think that, is it possible to get sponsored without any other developmental relationship present? Yes. I just think that's more rare. And often sponsoring evolves out of some connection or relationship, whether that's mentoring or some other exposure or connection. So I tend not to divorce those two. But I think the sponsoring advocacy piece is often missing. And to your point, Jeffrey, I think it's so important to getting to better gender equity. This requires men to put some real skin in the game, right? And it can't be performative. And I think that's what you're getting to, that maybe men do this to look good when the boss is watching, right? Hey, let me champion a woman. No, it can't look like that. Yeah. I have to be sincere. It's got to be authentic. People have to know that I really believe in her, that I'm her raving fan. Let me just give you a quick illustration. It was our favorite one from our research for our first book, Athena Rising. We got to interview Sheryl Sandberg, and she said, my first job out of college, I was the primary assistant to the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. And everywhere we went on the world stage, he would introduce me for 2 or 3 minutes to each new person we met. He'd say, this is Sheryl Sandberg. She's a rock star. She graduated #1 in economics from Harvard. I couldn't do my job without her. He would go on and on. And she pulled him aside and said, Larry, stop. That's embarrassing. And he said, Sheryl, this is how your career launches. This is how things take off for you. You need to let me do this for you, because if people know what I believe about you, they're going to want you to work for them too. I thought that was such a great illustration of being an authentic, raving fan. And I need to do that consistently. I need to talk about her when she's not in the room. And let me just say, this sometimes makes men uncomfortable, right? And I think that's one of the reasons we don't see women being sponsored. Beyond the bias that maybe she's not ready or she's not leadership material, the other contributor to lack of sponsorship is anxiety, I think men have. If I'm talking about her like this, if I'm her raving fan, will people assume there's something going on, or who knows? Men need to get over that. It's exposure therapy. You just need to do this more and more. And if you authentically sponsor men and women, people are simply going to know this is part of your brand. It's what you do. You recognize talent, you call it out. Another piece of this that I think is really important when it comes to gender, if I'm a male who's sponsoring a woman, and I should be doing that, one of the things I need to understand is the way some, not all women can be socialized to be reticent to put their hands in the air for a promotion, right? Mm-hmm. So women may get the message that, hey, if you do that, that's too assertive or abrasive or, whatever the language is. If I don't see her putting her name in, I'm going to go to her and say, hey, can we have a conversation about why you haven't applied for this advancement? I see you as the person for this. And I realize you haven't applied yet. I want to be sensitive if there are reasons you haven't, but I also want to share with you why I see you as the person who should get this next promotion. Sometimes that can be a powerful conversation in getting her to shift her view of whether or not she's ready for that promotion. And if she's on board, then I'm going to be all in on putting her name in the hat, pushing her forward, and then really showing up and talking about her behind her back in a very positive way.
Wonderful. So I have to ask from a intersectional perspective, based on your research, if we were talking to millennial men who had just been promoted first-time leaders, what would be one key action that they could take today, tomorrow, this week, in order for them to start doing this for the women on their team, for the women that will be on their team? What can those millennial men do?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the millennial guys, Amanda. I think that in some ways the millennials among us have an easier time than maybe guys like Dave and I would, just given our age, in thinking about this from what we call a 21st century leadership perspective, right? Millennials kind of straddle that 21st century leadership model. And when I think of 21st century leadership, I think of showing up with empathy and transparency and honesty and concern for how people I'm working with are experiencing the workplace environment. So I think in some ways, maybe millennials may have an easier time showing up as that kind of empathic colleague and ally and somebody who's interested in really powerful mentoring relationships. But some of the things that I could do, number one, I mentioned avoiding assumptions, but let's also show up with some real cultural humility, recognizing that I don't know this person's experience. I don't know what cultural identities matter most to him or her. And I really want to devote some time to understanding it, to building trust, and then communicating that I would really like to hear about the identities that matter most to you so I can be a more effective colleague and mentor. So I'd love to start there with some humility. I'd then love to do the discernment, right? If we're talking about mentoring or sponsoring, I mentioned the discernment. There's this phenomenon in social psychology called the Michelangelo phenomenon, where the best mentors and partners, by the way, show up with this sense that I'd love to know what the perfect world, perfect career, perfect life looks like for you. And I'm going to devote the time to discerning it. And then once I hear it, now I'm going to start opening doors and creating opportunities. I'm not going to try and clone you in my image, which is a very easy thing to try and do, right? Of course, you'll want to be just like me. No, I need to rein that in, find out, discern what your ideal career looks like, and then begin opening doors and creating opportunities. So the humility, the discernment, the inclusion, I think those are places I would begin.
I love it.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you. There's never enough time. And you have our commitment. We're going to bring you back. I could listen to you for hours. Just so amazing. For our listeners, Brad's book is available at your booksellers. But the biggest reason to go out and buy this is every chapter, and I love how you articulated this, has 6 to 10 actions at the end of each chapter on just how to get started, because that's a common question we get from men. What do you want me to do first? So for our female listeners, go out and buy the book and give it to man. It's Women's History Month, and this is your gift to them. So we will include a link to Brad's website. But for now, thank you, Brad, so much for joining us. And we enjoyed having you a guest on Wine Down Wednesday. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda and Jeffrey. It was a blast, and I'm going to transition to my hazy IPA now. So thank you.
All right. Sounds good.
Cheers.
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 Thanks again for joining us for Wine Down Wednesdays, a contemporary midweek discussion on current workplace and marketplace issues with a focus on diversity, inclusion, intersectionality, and equality. I'm Amanda Hammett, and on behalf of myself and Jeffrey Tobias Halter, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for joining us for Wine Down Wednesday. If you like this episode, please subscribe to receive more episodes straight to your inbox.